What if the people applauding your dreams are secretly hoping you never become the person those dreams require? What if the smiles, encouragement, and support you've received over the years weren't exactly what they appeared to be? Most people imagine opposition arriving in obvious ways. They expect criticism, arguments, rejection. They expect someone to stand directly in their path and announce that they do not want them to succeed. But life rarely works that way. According to the insights of Carl Jung, some of the strongest resistance we encounter doesn't come from strangers. It often comes from people who genuinely care about us, people who celebrate our milestones, people who tell us they believe in us, people who have stood beside us for years. And that is what makes it so difficult to recognize. Because when resistance wears the face of concern, loyalty, friendship, or even love, it becomes almost invisible. It appears in small moments. A conversation that suddenly feels different. A reaction that seems slightly out of place. A compliment that leaves you strangely unsettled. A silence where enthusiasm once existed. Most people dismiss these moments. They tell themselves they are imagining things. They assume they are being overly sensitive. They convince themselves nothing has changed. Yet somewhere deep inside, they feel it. They sense a shift they cannot fully explain. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand why some of the people who seem most supportive may actually struggle the most when your life begins to change. Several years ago, a woman we'll call Linda found herself standing at a crossroads she never expected to face. For most of her adult life, Linda had done everything people admired. She had been dependable. She had been generous. She had been available whenever someone needed help. Friends described her as selfless. Family members described her as reliable. Whenever there was a problem, Linda was the person everyone called. Whenever there was a burden to carry, Linda volunteered to carry it. And for many years, she believed this was what made her valuable. But somewhere in her late 50s, something began to change. The change did not arrive dramatically. There was no crisis, no shocking event, no life-altering announcement. Instead, it began with a question. A quiet question she found herself asking late at night when everyone else was asleep. What happened to the person I wanted to become? The question disturbed her. At first, she tried to ignore it. She buried herself in responsibilities. She focused on other people's needs. She convinced herself that dreaming was a luxury she could no longer afford. Yet the question refused to disappear. It followed her through ordinary days. It appeared during family gatherings. It surfaced during long drives. It lingered in the silence after phone calls ended. Eventually, Linda made a decision that seemed small to everyone else. But to her, it felt enormous. She decided to pursue something she had postponed for decades, something she had once loved, something she had quietly abandoned while building a life around the expectations of others. When she shared her plans, the response appeared positive. Everyone smiled. Everyone congratulated her. Everyone said they were happy for her. And for a while, she believed them. Why wouldn't she? The words sounded supportive. The reactions seemed encouraging. Nothing appeared wrong. But over the months that followed, Linda noticed something she could not explain. The excitement she felt wasn't being reflected back to her. The more committed she became to her new path, the more distant certain people seemed to become. Not hostile, not angry, just different. When she talked about her progress, conversations became shorter. When she shared good news, enthusiasm seemed restrained. When she discussed future plans, some people changed the subject. Others responded with caution. A few offered advice she had never asked for. Advice that always seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Slow down. Be realistic. Don't expect too much. Don't get your hopes up. At first, Linda assumed these comments were expressions of care, and perhaps some of them were. But as time passed, a troubling question entered her mind. Why did the people who once encouraged her seem uncomfortable now that she was actually changing? The answer to that question would force her to confront one of the most uncomfortable truths Carl Jung ever explored. Because sometimes growth creates reactions that have very little to do with the person growing, and everything to do with the people watching. What Rebecca was experiencing is far more common than most people realize. In fact, many viewers listening right now may have experienced something similar without ever fully understanding it. Perhaps it happened when you started setting boundaries. Perhaps it happened when you became more confident. Perhaps it happened when you stopped apologizing for taking up space. Perhaps it happened when you finally gave yourself permission to pursue a dream that had been waiting for years. At first, people seemed supportive. Then something shifted. The question is why? Why would someone's growth create discomfort in people who claim to care about them? Why would success create tension where there was once harmony? And why do some relationships feel strongest when we remain the same, yet become strained the moment we begin evolving? To answer that question, we need to understand one of Jung's most powerful ideas. An idea that reveals why personal transformation can awaken emotions people never intended to feel. And once you understand it, you'll never view certain relationships the same way again. The day everything changes rarely looks dramatic when it begins. There is no warning sign, no announcement, no moment that clearly separates the old life from the new one. Most of the time, it starts with a decision so small that nobody around you believes it will matter. That was exactly how it happened for Linda. At 58 years old, Linda had spent most of her life taking care of everyone else. She was the person who remembered birthdays, the person who checked on family members, the person who rearranged her schedule whenever someone needed help. If a friend was struggling, Linda listened. If a relative needed support, Linda showed up. If there was a conflict, she worked hard to keep the peace. Over the years, she became known as dependable, reliable, selfless, the kind of person everyone appreciated. At least that was what she believed. Like many women, Linda had quietly placed her own ambitions on hold. There had always been reasons. Children needed attention. Family responsibilities came first. Financial obligations had to be met. Someone always needed something. And so the years passed. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. Eventually, the dreams she once carried seemed less important than the responsibilities she carried every day. Then one evening, something happened. Nothing extraordinary. No crisis. No life-changing event. Just a simple realization. As Linda sat alone reflecting on her life, she found herself asking a question she had avoided for decades. What would happen if I finally chose myself? The question unsettled her. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she did. Deep down, she knew there were still parts of herself waiting to be explored. Parts she had neglected. Parts she had sacrificed. Parts she had convinced herself no longer mattered. For weeks, the thought stayed with her. Then eventually she made a decision. She would return to school. Not because she needed to. Not because anyone expected her to. But because there was something she still wanted to learn. Something she still wanted to become. At the same time, she began exploring a small business idea she had carried in her mind for years. Nothing extravagant. Nothing reckless. Just a dream she had postponed for far too long. When she finally shared her plans, the reactions seemed positive. Friends congratulated her. Family members smiled. People told her they were proud of her. Many even described her decision as inspiring. For the first few weeks, Linda felt encouraged. She felt supported. She felt hopeful. After all, the people closest to her appeared happy about the changes she was making. But then something happened. Something difficult to describe. The support remained, at least on the surface. The encouraging words didn't disappear. The smiles didn't disappear. Yet somehow the energy felt different. Conversations began changing. When Linda spoke about her classes, people seemed less interested than before. When she shared progress about her business, responses became shorter. The excitement that once filled conversations seemed noticeably absent. At first she ignored it. Everyone has busy days, she told herself. Everyone gets distracted. Everyone has their own concerns. But as months passed, the pattern became harder to dismiss. Phone calls became less frequent. Invitations became less common. People who once eagerly asked about her plans suddenly stopped asking altogether. Some began offering warnings. Be careful. Don't overwork yourself. Maybe you're taking on too much. Are you sure this is worth it at your age? The comments sounded reasonable, even caring, and perhaps some of them genuinely were. But Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening beneath the surface. What confused her most was that these reactions weren't coming from strangers. They were coming from people who had previously encouraged her. People who had told her she deserved happiness. People who claimed they wanted the best for her. One afternoon, after sharing a major accomplishment she had worked hard to achieve, she noticed something she would never forget. The room became quiet. Not hostile, not angry, just quiet. The enthusiasm she expected never arrived. Instead, The conversation moved on almost immediately. The moment lasted only seconds. But those seconds revealed something she had been trying not to see. For the first time, Linda wondered whether some people had been comfortable supporting her dreams only as long as those dreams remained distant, as long as they remained possibilities, as long as they remained harmless. Because a dream is easy to celebrate when it lives in someone's imagination. A transformation is much harder to celebrate when it becomes real. That realization marked the beginning of a journey Linda never expected. A journey that would force her to confront uncomfortable truths about relationships, identity, and the hidden emotions people often keep from themselves. More importantly, it would lead her directly into one of Carl Jung's most profound psychological discoveries. Because Linda's story reveals something most people never recognize until it's already happening. The people around you may not be reacting to your success at all. They may be reacting to what your success awakens inside them. And that changes everything. As Linda continued moving forward, she found herself returning to the same question again and again. Why did everything feel different? Nothing about her decision was hurting anyone. She wasn't taking something away from the people she loved. She wasn't abandoning her responsibilities. She wasn't creating conflict. If anything, she felt happier, healthier, and more fulfilled than she had in years. So why did certain relationships suddenly feel strained? Why did some conversations leave her feeling as though she had crossed an invisible line she never knew existed? The answer begins with a simple observation Carl Jung understood deeply. Human beings rarely measure themselves against strangers. We measure ourselves against people who share our world. The people we grew up with. The people we work beside. The people we spend holidays with. The people who know our history. A stranger's success may impress us, but the success of someone close to us affects us differently, because it forces comparison, and comparison often leads to reflection. Reflection leads to questions, and questions can lead to discomfort. This is especially true when someone's transformation challenges a story we've been telling ourselves for years. For example, imagine a woman who once dreamed of starting her own business. Perhaps she talked about it often when she was younger. Perhaps she imagined the freedom it would bring, the purpose, the fulfillment. But life happened. Responsibilities arrived. Time passed. The dream slowly faded into the background. Eventually, she stopped thinking about it altogether. Or at least she believed she had. Then one day, she watches her friend take a risk. She watches her friend enroll in classes. She watches her friend build something new. She watches her friend become more confident, more independent, more willing to pursue what she truly wants. Suddenly, something unexpected happens. The dream she buried years ago begins to stir. Questions she had avoided begin resurfacing. Possibilities she once abandoned return to her thoughts. And without realizing it, she finds herself confronting something painful. Not her friend's transformation, her own unfinished story. This is why growth can become uncomfortable to witness. Because growth acts like a mirror, and mirrors reveal things we would sometimes rather not see. They reflect the decisions we've made, the opportunities we've missed, the risks we didn't take, the versions of ourselves we left behind. When Linda began changing, she unknowingly became a mirror for many of the people around her. A mirror reflecting possibility, a mirror reflecting courage, a mirror reflecting action. And while some people found that inspiring, others found it difficult. Not because they wished her harm, not because they wanted her to fail, but because her transformation invited them to ask questions they had spent years avoiding. Questions like, what happened to the goals I once had? Why did I stop believing in myself? What would my life look like if I had made different choices? These questions rarely arrive comfortably. In fact, most people instinctively push them away. The mind often protects itself from discomfort by finding explanations that feel safer. Instead of examining their own disappointment, some people begin focusing on the person triggering those emotions. Instead of asking why they feel unsettled, they begin questioning the choices of the person who is changing. And this is where subtle shifts begin appearing. Support becomes cautious. Encouragement becomes restrained. Interest becomes distance. Without fully understanding why, they start pulling back. Linda couldn't see this at first. All she knew was that something felt different. The warmth she once felt from certain people seemed harder to find. The enthusiasm that greeted her early successes seemed to fade. Some relationships felt frozen in time, as though the people around her preferred the version of Linda they had always known. The version who sacrificed, the version who accommodated, the version who never disrupted expectations. But the more Linda evolved, the harder it became to fit into that familiar role. And that created tension, not necessarily spoken tension, not obvious tension, the kind of tension that exists beneath the surface of ordinary conversations, the kind that reveals itself through tone, silence, and subtle reactions. Carl Jung understood this dynamic better than most. He recognized that people often experience powerful emotions they cannot fully explain, emotions that seem irrational, emotions that appear disconnected from reality, emotions that emerge from parts of the mind they rarely examine. And according to Jung, this is where the story becomes far more interesting. Because comparison alone does not explain what Linda was experiencing. The discomfort surrounding her transformation was being fueled by something deeper, something hidden, something operating beneath conscious awareness, something Jung called the shadow. And once we understand the shadow, we begin to understand why admiration can quietly transform into resentment, why support can become resistance, and why the people cheering for your growth may sometimes struggle the most when that growth becomes real. Because Jung believed something even deeper was operating beneath the surface. To understand what was happening around Linda, we need to understand one of Carl Jung's most important ideas. An idea that explains why people can sincerely care about someone and still struggle when that person begins to change. Jung called it the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not a dark force hiding inside people. It is simply the collection of parts of ourselves we fail to recognize, refuse to acknowledge, or push out of conscious awareness. It contains fears we don't want to face, desires we don't want to admit, ambitions we convinced ourselves no longer matter, possibilities we abandoned long ago. In many ways, the shadow is like a forgotten room inside the mind, a room we locked years ago, a room filled with memories, dreams, talents, regrets, and unanswered questions. Most people spend their lives walking past that door without opening it. Some eventually forget it exists at all. But forgetting something does not make it disappear. It simply waits, quietly, patiently, beneath awareness. Jung believed this hidden part of the psyche influences far more of our behavior than most people realize, especially when we encounter someone who reminds us of what we left behind. Imagine walking through an old house you haven't visited in decades. At the end of a hallway, you notice a door you once closed, a door you haven't opened in years. The moment you see it, memories begin returning. Dreams you once carried, goals you once imagined, versions of yourself you once hoped to become. For many people, this experience is uncomfortable, not because the memories are harmful, but because they force confrontation with possibilities that were never fully explored. This is often how the shadow reveals itself, not through dramatic events, through reminders. And sometimes those reminders come in the form of another person. As Linda continued growing, she unknowingly became that reminder. Her decision to return to school, her willingness to start something new, her determination to pursue a dream she had delayed for decades. All of it reflected something back to the people around her, something they may not have wanted to examine. Some saw inspiration, others saw opportunity. But for certain people, Linda became a mirror. And mirrors can reveal more than we expect. They show us who we are, but they also show us who we might have been. This is where the experience becomes deeply personal. Because when someone close to us begins living a possibility we abandoned, an uncomfortable question often emerges. What if I could have done the same? For some people, that question sparks motivation. For others, it awakens regret. And regret is one of the most difficult emotions to face honestly. It asks us to revisit unfinished paths. It asks us to examine choices we made years ago. It asks us to acknowledge that certain doors may have remained closed not because they were impossible to open, but because we were afraid to turn the handle. Many people would rather avoid those questions altogether, and so the mind looks for another solution. Instead of confronting the forgotten room, it focuses on the person who opened theirs. Instead of examining the unfinished path, it examines the person still walking. Without realizing it, admiration begins mixing with discomfort. Encouragement begins mixing with hesitation. Support begins mixing with emotions that are harder to identify. Not because they hate the person, not because they wish them harm, because they remind them. They remind them of the dreams they postponed, the risks they avoided, the opportunities they never pursued, the talents they never developed. The possibilities they quietly buried beneath years of responsibility, fear, or self-doubt. Linda wasn't creating these emotions. She was revealing them. And that distinction is important, because many people spend years believing they caused the tension surrounding their growth. They assume they became too ambitious, too independent, too different, when in reality, their transformation simply illuminated something that was already present, something hidden beneath the surface, something waiting in the forgotten rooms of another person's mind. Jung understood that people rarely react to reality alone. They react to what reality symbolizes. And Linda's transformation symbolized something powerful. Proof that change was still possible. Proof that it wasn't too late. Proof that a person could choose a different path even after decades of living another one. For some, that message felt hopeful. For others, it felt unsettling. Because every step Linda took forward illuminated an unfinished path they had stopped looking at years ago. And this is why support sometimes transforms into something much more complicated. By this point, Linda had stopped wondering whether something was changing. Something was changing. The difficult part was understanding what. No one had openly criticized her. No one had told her to stop. No one had directly opposed her efforts. Yet the shift was undeniable. The reactions surrounding her growth had become more complicated. And once Linda began paying attention, she noticed certain patterns appearing again and again. Patterns Carl Jung believed reveal far more than most people realize. The first sign was surprisingly subtle. People supported her plans, but became distant when she succeeded. When Linda first announced she was returning to school, the encouragement was immediate. People congratulated her. They praised her courage. They told her she deserved this opportunity. The idea of change felt exciting, inspiring, even. But something different happened when the idea became reality. As her grades improved, enthusiasm seemed to fade. As her confidence grew, conversations became shorter. As her business gained momentum, some of the people who once cheered the loudest appeared strangely uninterested. Linda found this confusing. After all, wasn't success supposed to be the outcome everyone wanted? Yet dreams are often easier to celebrate than transformations. A dream exists safely in the future. Success exists in the present. And the moment success becomes visible, comparison becomes harder to avoid. The second sign appeared whenever Linda evolved. People reminded her of her past. At first, the comments seemed harmless. Remember when you used to say you weren't good with technology? Remember when you were afraid to speak in front of people? Remember when you almost quit after the first week? The stories themselves weren't negative. But Linda noticed something interesting. The more she changed, the more certain people seemed determined to remind her who she used to be, almost as if they were struggling to accept who she was becoming. Jung believed people create psychological images of those around them. These images provide comfort. They create stability. They help us predict the world. But when someone changes significantly, those images become outdated. And not everyone adapts easily. Sometimes people hold on to the old version because it feels safer than accepting the new one. The third sign was even more revealing. Achievements were quietly minimized. One afternoon, Linda shared exciting news. After months of hard work, she had reached a milestone she once believed was impossible. The accomplishment meant a great deal to her, not because of recognition, but because it represented years of persistence. She expected excitement. Instead, she received a brief response. "That's nice." Then the conversation moved on. On another occasion, someone replied with a smile and said, "Well, it's not that big of a deal." The words were simple. The tone was polite. Yet something felt off. Linda wasn't seeking applause. What surprised her was the absence of genuine enthusiasm. Because when people are truly excited for someone, they tend to celebrate their victories, even small ones. They ask questions. They show interest. They share the joy. When achievements are repeatedly minimized, it sometimes reveals an internal struggle that has little to do with the achievement itself. The fourth sign was emotional distance. This one hurt the most, because it often appeared without explanation. People who once called regularly became harder to reach. Conversations became shorter. Interactions felt less personal. The warmth that once existed seemed to fade. Linda spent months wondering if she had done something wrong. Perhaps she had become too focused on her goals. Perhaps she was imagining things. But over time, she began noticing that the distance appeared most strongly whenever discussions centered around her growth. Whenever the conversation returned to familiar territory, everything seemed normal. But whenever the subject shifted toward her future, a subtle wall appeared. Jung understood that emotional withdrawal is sometimes a protective response, not always against another person, sometimes against emotions within ourselves, feelings we would rather not examine, questions we would rather not answer. The fifth sign was perhaps the most difficult to recognize. People encouraged staying the same, not directly, not aggressively, but gently, almost lovingly. Why work so hard? Why make life more complicated? Why take risks now? Why rock the boat? The advice sounded reasonable. In many cases, it may have been offered with sincere concern. But Linda noticed something important. The advice almost always pointed in one direction, backward, toward familiarity, toward comfort, toward the version of herself everyone already understood. Very few people encouraged expansion with the same intensity they encouraged caution. And that realization forced Linda to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes people become attached to who we were, not because they wish us harm, because our old identity helped them feel secure. It kept relationships predictable. It preserved familiar roles. It allowed everyone to remain exactly where they had always been. Growth changes that arrangement. Growth introduces uncertainty. Growth asks everyone around us to adjust. An adjustment is not always easy, especially when the transformation is real. By now, Linda could see these signs more clearly. The distance, the reminders, the minimized achievements, the emotional withdrawal, the encouragement to remain unchanged. Yet none of these signs answered the question that troubled her most. Because the people displaying these behaviors were not enemies. Many of them genuinely cared about her. Many had supported her for years. Many loved her, which raises a much deeper question. If these reactions aren't coming from hatred, if they aren't coming from malice, if they aren't coming from a desire to see someone fail, then where are they coming from? And why does this happen most often among people who genuinely care about you? This was the question Linda could no longer ignore. Why did the people closest to her seem to struggle the most with her growth? Why did encouragement sometimes feel limited? Why did support sometimes feel conditional? And why did the shift appear strongest among those she loved the most? To understand this, Linda had to look beyond surface behavior. Because Carl Jung believed something important about human relationships. Most people do not consciously decide to hold someone back. They do not sit in judgment and plan resistance. They do not actively wish to limit another person's growth. Instead, something more subtle happens. Relationships are built on familiarity, on shared patterns, on predictable roles. Over time, people learn where they fit in each other's lives. Who is the helper? Who is the listener? Who is the responsible one? Who is the dependent one? These roles create stability. They create emotional safety. They create a sense of identity within relationships. But when one person begins to change significantly, those roles begin to shift. And that shift creates uncertainty. For Linda, this became increasingly clear. Her friend, who had always been the more outgoing one, began to feel quieter in comparison. Her sibling, who once gave advice, started to feel unsure when Linda began making confident decisions. Even in close relationships, subtle imbalances began to appear. Not because anyone wanted them, but because change was reshaping the structure they had always known. A friend who feels left behind does not always express it directly. Instead, they may withdraw slightly, or change the subject when progress is discussed, or focus on shared memories instead of current achievements. A sibling who feels inadequate may not say it aloud, but they may begin to revisit old versions of your identity, reminding you of who you used to be, not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort with comparison. A spouse or long-term partner may experience something even more complex, because growth in one person can create fear of emotional distance. If one person evolves, the other may quietly wonder whether they are still connected in the same way, whether they are still needed, whether they still belong in the same space they once occupied. These reactions are not always spoken, but they are often felt. Jung understood this deeply. He recognized that human beings are not just individuals. They are also part of psychological systems built through shared experience. When one part of that system changes, the entire structure adjusts. An adjustment can feel unsettling. This is why growth can feel disruptive even when it is positive. Not because people oppose it, but because they must now redefine their place within it. Linda began to realize that her transformation was not just personal. It was relational. It affected how people saw her, how they related to her, how they understood themselves in relation to her. And this is where the emotional complexity deepens. Because when someone close to us changes, it does not only challenge their identity, it can also challenge ours. If Linda is becoming more confident, what does that say about the version of me that stayed the same? If Linda is pursuing long postponed dreams, what does that reveal about the dreams I abandoned? If Linda is evolving, what does that mean for the parts of me that remain unchanged? These questions are rarely spoken out loud, but they often exist beneath the surface. And when they are not consciously examined, they can shape behavior in subtle ways. A shorter conversation, a delayed response, a reduced level of enthusiasm, a cautious tone, a shift in emotional presence, not as rejection, but as internal adjustment. Jung warned that this is where many people make a life-changing mistake. This was the point Linda had been unknowingly approaching all along. The moment where awareness turns into a choice. Because once you begin to see the patterns clearly, something uncomfortable becomes impossible to ignore. Many people do not stop growing because they lack ability. They stop growing because they want to remain emotionally safe in the eyes of others. They want to avoid tension, avoid misunderstanding, avoid disappointment, avoid the quiet shifts in tone, energy, and attention that sometimes follow change. So instead, they begin adjusting themselves, not in dramatic ways, but in small, almost invisible decisions. They shrink their ambitions slightly so others feel comfortable. They delay their dreams until a better time that never quite arrives. They stay within roles that feel familiar, even when those roles no longer reflect who they are becoming. And over time, something subtle happens. Their life begins to revolve not around what they want, but around what others can tolerate. Carl Jung believed this is one of the most common psychological traps in human development. The need for approval. Approval creates a sense of belonging. It creates emotional safety. It creates the feeling that we are accepted, understood, and valued. But it also has a hidden cost. Because approval is often tied to expectations. And expectations are often tied to consistency. People feel most comfortable when we remain familiar, when we behave in predictable ways, when we stay within the identity they already understand. But growth does not respect familiarity. Growth changes patterns. It challenges expectations. It introduces versions of ourselves that others have not yet adjusted to. And this is where the conflict begins. Linda began to understand this more deeply as she reflected on her own journey. There were moments when she felt tempted to soften her progress, to speak less about her goals, to avoid certain conversations, to make her growth appear smaller than it actually was. Not because she lacked confidence, but because she could sense the emotional reactions around her, the subtle shifts, the reduced enthusiasm, the quiet hesitation. And for a moment, she understood why so many people choose the easier path, the path of staying the same. Because approval feels immediate. It feels reassuring. It feels like connection. While transformation often feels uncertain, it asks for patience. It asks for resilience. It asks for willingness to be misunderstood for a time. Jung called this process individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, not who you were told to be, not who others expect you to remain, but the full expression of your own identity. And Jung understood something essential about this journey. You cannot fully become yourself while remaining entirely shaped by everyone else's expectations. At some point, something must be released. The need for universal approval, the need for constant agreement, the need for everyone to feel comfortable with your direction. Because if those needs remain in control, growth becomes restricted, not by external force, but by internal hesitation. Linda began to see that many of her earlier decisions had been shaped by this invisible pressure. Not dramatic pressure, not explicit pressure, but emotional pressure. The desire to keep relationships smooth. The desire to avoid discomfort. The desire to ensure that no one felt left behind or unsettled by her choices. And slowly, she realized something important. Every time she adjusted herself to maintain approval, she was also adjusting her own future. Every time she softened her ambition, she was also delaying her transformation. Every time she prioritized comfort over growth, she was choosing familiarity over possibility. And that realization led to a question she could no longer avoid. A question that sat quietly beneath everything she had experienced. How much of my life has been shaped by the fear of disappointing others? The question did not demand an immediate answer. It did not rush her. It simply remained there, present, honest, unavoidable. And in that silence, Linda began to understand something she had never fully seen before, that the cost of approval is often invisible until you begin to outgrow it. And once you notice it, you can no longer unsee it. For Linda, the turning point did not arrive as a single moment of revelation. It arrived slowly, through experience, through reflection, through noticing what had always been there, but never fully understood. At first, she believed growth was supposed to feel universally supported, that becoming better, stronger, more fulfilled would naturally bring everyone closer. But life showed her something different, something more complex. Because as she continued changing, she began to understand a difficult truth. Growth is not always received as celebration. Sometimes it is received as disruption, not because it is wrong, but because it changes the emotional balance people are used to. And this is where everything begins to shift. Linda started to realize that her growth was not an act of betrayal. She was not abandoning anyone simply by choosing herself. She was not rejecting the people she cared about by pursuing her own path. She was not doing something wrong by evolving beyond old limitations. Growth is not betrayal. Boundaries are not selfish. Authenticity is not rejection. These ideas slowly began to take shape in her mind, and with them came a sense of relief she had not felt in years. Because for so long, she had carried the quiet fear that becoming more of herself might mean losing connection with others. But what she began to see was something different. Sometimes becoming yourself changes relationships, not because something is being taken away, but because something is being redefined. Carl Jung described this process as individuation, the journey toward becoming whole, a process where a person gradually separates from external expectations and internalized roles to become who they truly are. Not who they were told to be, not who others find most comfortable, but who they are at the deepest level of their being. Linda began to see that much of her earlier life had been shaped by roles she never consciously chose. The dependable one, the accommodating one, the one who kept things stable. Those roles were not false, but they were incomplete. And as she grew, she could no longer fit entirely within them. This realization brought both clarity and tension, because individuation does not only change the person experiencing it, it also changes the relationships around them. Some people adjust, some people step closer, some people quietly step back, not out of rejection, but out of unfamiliarity with the new dynamic. And Linda began to understand that this was not something to fear. It was something to accept. Because growth was never meant to preserve every relationship exactly as it was. It was meant to reveal what was real, what was flexible, and what could evolve alongside it. Which leads to Jung's most powerful insight. That understanding would change everything Linda thought she knew about connection, change, and identity. Because it reframes the entire experience, not as loss, but as clarity, not as separation, but as truth becoming visible. And once that truth becomes visible, it cannot be unseen. Final chapter, Jung's final lesson. Perhaps the people who struggle with your growth are not revealing something about your worth. Perhaps they're revealing something about their own unfinished journey. Your transformation was never meant to make everyone comfortable. It was meant to make you whole. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is continuing forward, even when the applause begins to fade. Because the value of your path is not measured by how loudly others cheer for it. It is measured by whether it remains true when no one fully understands it but you. And as Linda finally came to understand this, she no longer saw the changes around her as rejection. She saw them as reflection, a reflection of growth, a reflection of distance between who she was and who she was becoming. And that understanding brought a quiet kind of peace, because it meant she no longer had to shrink her life to preserve comfort. She could simply continue forward, not to prove anything, not to convince anyone, but to become whole. Because the people who fear your transformation are often reacting to a possibility they once saw in themselves. And once you understand that, their resistance no longer becomes your responsibility. If this video resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever noticed a relationship change when you began growing or transforming? And if you're ready to continue exploring the hidden patterns of human psychology, subscribe